In this video, we'll look at creating a custom component, which is a step that you'll need to take in the schematic software for all 4 of the sensors that you're using in this project. So when you're using a standard library component, or the power and ground symbols, you just come to the component manager, which has a whole library of options. If you need to represent, for example, your temperature and humidity sensor, you'll need to create that custom because that's not a component that exists in the component manager. So when you look on the toolbar, if you hover over any of these tools, you can get a quick description of what each tool is. Like, I'd like to highlight that placing a wire is different than drawing a line. Wires are electrical connections and lines are geometry. And pins here are different than corners and wires. So pins are, you're going to want to pin on components that are numbered and identified as to what they're connected to. So I'm going to create that temperature humidity sensor. I'm not bringing up the spec sheet, so I might have the connections not quite right. So I would like to encourage you to open up your specification sheet when you're making the sensor and double check which pin number is attached to which signal. So you can just barely see this. I'm going to zoom in now using my scroll wheel. So I placed 4 pins. They're actually pretty close together, so I'm going to spread them out a little bit. You'll notice I'm putting them on the grid. It just makes it a neat layout in the software. So I placed 4 of the pins, and now I'll double click on each one in turn and give it a pin number, 1 through 4. And each pin I will label with its signal. So I'm going to assume that pin 1 here is temperature. Like I said, double check that on the sensor. Then I'll label pin 2. And I know temperature and ground are on the same side. So then I have pin 3. I'll assume that's voltage. And pin 4 we'll call RH. So I have 4 pins. And I'm going to move my text out of the way for a second so that I can draw now the geometry of the sensor. So I'll choose the rectangle. I could also use lines to make a rectangle, but I just want to draw a physical structure here for my sensor. This doesn't have to necessarily fall on the grid. And then I'll connect these pins to the sensors so it's obvious that this is all one item. So again, I will use the line, not the wire, because this is just artwork basically. Right-click turns the line tool off. So here we go. Just visually representing that these pins are attached to this sensor. And now I'll choose my selector tool so I can move some of this around. So I've got pin 1, its temperature, pin 2, and its label. Maybe it's clearer if it's over there. Pin 4. I didn't make this quite big enough, so you might want to spread things out just a little bit more. Okay, that's enough of that. So, so this is now 4 disconnected pins. The software still doesn't know it's one component. So the last step of making this a sensor is I select the whole thing, and I come up to the component menu, and I group it into a component. Just like with standard components, you have to give it a unique identifier. So I'll call this U1. It's my first one. And I'll give it a name so I know what it is. And because it's a little small, I'll leave this on the outside. But now this is 4 pins that are connected to a single component, and it has an identifier, which will be useful when I link my schematic to my PCB design. Last step here would be to connect it up, so let's add some symbols. I know I need 5 volts. That comes over here. And I know I need ground. Notice I don't need to add a wire to those. I can just attach it straight to the pin. I can also choose to move it away. I think it'll automatically insert a wire. It does. So that's how you would do that. In order to do RH and temperature, I would need that 8-pin connector, right? And here, I don't want to use geometry. I want to use electrical connections, wires. So let's say pin 2 will be temperatures resistance, and I'll make, I don't know, pin 3 here, RH. What didn't I do? I inserted a connector and I didn't give it an identifier. So now, once you're done, the last step here would be to save and then check for netlist errors. So if you have anything that's disconnected or unlabeled, it will tell you in that window. So that's the basics of creating a custom component and connecting it to other components in the schematics software.